Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this week, with Rabbi Adam Mintz and Michael Posnick, we discover the revolutionary nature of the public reading of our sacred texts, both on the sabbatical year and every Shabbat. We use this as an excuse to explore the revolutionary nature of the Hebrew alphabet from both a social and technological perspective. So throw away your scholarly journals and take out your grammar school notebooks as we explore the Aleph Bet Revolution. Welcome to Madlik Disruptive Torah. We are every Friday at 4 o'clock here on Clubhouse on Eastern Time. And we go ahead and record this, and then we post it as a podcast called Madlik, and it's available on all of your favorite podcasting channels. And if you like what you hear today, go ahead and listen to it as a podcast and share it with your friends and give us a few stars and say something nice about us. In any case, this week, portion of Vayelech, and it's Deuteronomy 31 for the most part. And in Deuteronomy 31 verse 9, it says, "And Moses wrote down this teaching, and he gave it to the priests, sons of Levy, who carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses instructed them as follows. Every seventh year, the year set for shmitah, at the Feast of Booths, which will start in another week or two, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, you shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere the Lord your God and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere the Lord your God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess." And then a few verses down, it finishes off by saying, "When Moses had put down in writing the words of this teaching to the very end, ad tumam, Moses charged the Levites who carry the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, 'Take this book of teaching and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and let it remain there as a witness against you.'" So, wow, this is a pretty fundamental law. It touches upon a public reading of the Torah. It touches upon the seventh year, the cycle of the shmitah, of the sabbatical year that we are starting as we speak. And it also talks about placing that Torah scroll, if you will, into the ark right next to the Ten Commandments. So, Rabbi, what says this to you?
So I want to go to the end. It's so interesting that the Torah scroll plays a role here. It all seems to be about strengthening our commitment to Torah and to God. And therefore, everything has a Torah scroll that is right in the middle of it. And I think that's really, really interesting. At the end of each shmitah cycle, they used to gather all the people in Jerusalem, the men, the women, the children, and the king used to read the Torah. So really, even the sabbatical year is about strengthening our commitment to Torah.
I totally agree, but I have to confess that when I tell people, and I've been telling everybody I can, trust me, that this is the sabbatical year, unlike the Sabbath that occurs every 7 days, and I'd like to think, we can discuss this on another afternoon, I'd like to think it was one of the Jews' greatest contributions to culture and society. A day of rest. It's actually a statement of human rights, because you rest, your servants rest, your animals were at rest. That everybody kinds of gets, whether they keep the Sabbath on a Saturday or Sunday or a Friday, or they just understand they have to reboot once in a while. But the idea of this 7th year cycle, the sabbatical, that has only really survived in academia. And I hope it's still the case, where academics take off a year to broaden their horizons, to travel, to see other academics and maybe go out into the field. It struck me when I read this portion that, wow, there actually is a connection, because mostly when we think of the sabbatical year, we think of letting the land lie fallow and all of the other things I discussed before. But there is clearly an intellectual aspect of this. And that's what you were talking about, Rabbi, in terms of both faith and understanding. The idea was, in this sabbatical year, we all have to give ourselves a chance to be exposed to that which is important to us. But it kind of works both ways, because on the Sabbath, we also read from the Torah publicly. And the rabbis understood the connection between this, because those of you who have been in an Orthodox synagogue and know that the first aliyah, the first calling up to the Torah, is for the Kohen, and the second one is for the Levy, the Talmud learns it literally from this verse. If you recall, it says that in verse 9, that Moses wrote down this teaching, gave it to the priests, the Kohanim, sons of Levi. From here, the rabbis learned that the Kohen gets the first aliyah and the Levi gets the second. And then, of course, the Israelite gets the third and onward. But I'm less interested in the law, and I'm more interested in the connections the rabbis took from this annual reading, or the 7-year cycle of reading it in the sabbatical year, and reading it every week. In both cases, we're kind of doing this amazing public discourse of our most important texts.
Yes. And I think that's a super interesting thing. The fact that the Torah, even though study is an individual act, we do it by ourselves. We do it with a chavruta, with one other individual. But actually, the reading of the Torah is always a public act. That's something fascinating, isn't it, Geoffrey? Right? The Torah is a public act. We read it in the temple. We read it in the synagogue. It's always public.
I totally agree, and we're going to get a little bit more into that in a second. But before we do, the other thing that is kind of interesting to me is that the reading of it is also a conduit into the future. And you see that in two ways. If you recall, in verse 13, it says, "And their children who have not had the experience shall hear and learn." And the idea is, even though they were speaking in the present tense, and as it said, they were crossing the Jordan into the promised land, this was not to be limited to the people in the room, so to speak. This was the vehicle for transmitting this experience into the future. This interactive, maybe immersive reading of our sacred texts in public, placing them in a tactile form on the side of the shattered and full 10 Commandments, was an amazing both commentary and commitment to what the written and spoken word can do in terms of transmitting ideas and values into the future.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's a very important thing, and that's why we're kind of not focusing on this, but this is the end of the Torah. This is the third to the last portion in the Torah. We have Ha'azinu next week, and then on Simchat Torah, we finish the Torah with Bezot HaBracha. This is the end, Geoffrey. So whatever is going on now is a lesson forever.
I love the fact that you say it is the end. It both gives this statement more importance, but it also raises another fascinating Talmudic discussion. And that is the last 6 or 8 verses of the Torah are written in the narrative after Moses dies. So the question comes, how can it be in our verses that Moses gives the complete Torah to the priests and the tribe of Levi if in those last few verses are things that clearly he could not have written? And the Talmud gives two answers. One answer is, you're right, Moses wrote everything except the last 8 verses, and Joshua wrote the book under his name, the book of Joshua, and the last 8 verses. But what I find so dramatic, and those of you who were with us last week know how much drama there can be in our wonderful Torah, I love the answer that was Rabbi Shimon's. And he says, is it possible that the Torah scroll was missing a single letter? But it has said, take this Torah scroll. Rather, until this point, the Holy One, blessed be he, dictated, and Moses repeated after him and wrote the text. From the point where it says that Moses is died, the Holy One, blessed be he, dictated, and Moses wrote with tears. Just an unbelievable image of someone writing their own obituary, so to speak. But again, the reason I bring it up is because it really parallels this concept of having the children who had not experienced listen to it. Even in the ending of the Torah, it is understood that the writing of the Torah either continues in the hand of other people like Joshua, or that we are all part of a narrative and we can't experience every part that we're in. But by hearing it and listening to it, we become a part of that narrative. And that to me, Moses writing and tears streaming down his cheeks is just almost too much to bear.
I mean, Geoffrey, you're not so surprised because, as we all know, if you're anybody, the New York Times has your obituary on file, right? The famous people get their obituaries written ahead of time. So it's interesting, the whole idea of writing your own obituary. I'll just tell you that there was a rabbi, his name was the Vilna Gaon, a great rabbi in Lithuania in the 1700s. And he says that the word for tears, dema, can also be translated as the word dimua, which means mixed up. And he says that what happened was that God commanded Moshe, like a Scrabble board, to take all of the letters that would appear in the last 8 verses of the Torah, but not to arrange them in order. And Joshua was the one who arranged them in order.
Wow, that absolutely blows me away, and we are going to come back to it. But to give you a little taste of how we're going to come back to that is so much of the Yom Kippur liturgy has to do with that alphabet that you just described, whether it's the Oshamnu that is an acronymically has our alphabet or whatever. So the story that you just told of the Vilna Gaon's explanation of Joshua putting the letters together is something that really resonates with me, and we are going to come back to. Michael Posnick, welcome to the Bima.
It's a pleasure to be here. I just have a question. Is it possible that the word for tears could be from dome, from Dumama, that Moses wrote this?
Like Unetana Tokem, the Kol Dumama Daka Yishama.
That's right, that he wrote it in silence.
It's nice. Technically speaking, root of the word Dema is Dalid Mem Ayin. The root of the word dimama, meaning silence, is Dalid Mem Mem. They're 2 different words. So it's a nice sermon, but technically speaking, in terms of language, it's not really the same word.
And of course, you have Aaron, who after his 2 sons died, it says Vayidom, and he normally translated as silent. Is that the word that it should be translated?
That's the word. The word dome is the word demama.
Got it.
We say uvishofa. We say in Utana Tokef, say Uvishofar gadol yitaka. We blow the mighty shofar. V'kol demama daka yishama. But the sound that we hear is a silent or a quiet sound.
Fantastic. The truth is, and this will also come up in our discussion, that there are those who believe, and I think the most prominent pushers of this theory were Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, and their current student, who's a professor named Everett Fox, who believes that much of the Torah has to be listened to as much as read. And therefore, it gives you a little bit more, I think, flexibility and wiggle room, poetic license, if you will, to make some of these connections. But even if, from a strict grammatical point of view, there are limitations, then there's also the pun. And I think that the biblical text and certainly Talmudic texts were very sensitive to words that might have been different but sounded alike, that conjure up certain emotions and certain responses. So I think there's no question that the connection that you made, Michael, is there at some level.
Yeah, very nice, and especially because it relates to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with Unatan Tokef, it really is just right. So thank you so much, Michael.
So let's move on a little bit. The title of today's episode, if you will, is the Aleph Bet Revolution. And the reason why it is a revolution is there are scholars. The one I most recently read is somebody named Joshua Berman, who wrote a book, Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, who believe that what happened when the Aleph Bet was created in Canaan was as revolutionary as the printing press when it was created in Europe. And we all know what happened when the printing press was created. Within a very short time, not only did people for the first time get to read their Bible, because that was the first book that was written and publicized, but there were people like Luther who were able to get out a mimeograph machine, so to speak, and start posting things on the doors of the church. And all of a sudden, a whole revolution occurred within Christianity. And you could even argue maybe the Judeo-Christian tradition, because people were already all of a sudden exposed to text in ways that they never were. And these scholars argue that when the Jews, the Israelites, were in Canaan, they were surrounded by two empires who pretty much used cuneiform hieroglyphics. These are highly intricate ways of expressing whether it's numbers or events or narratives or stories using pictures. And the vocabulary was so large that only the scribes could master it. So it was something that was never given to the general public. And even when they had, like the Gilgamesh epic or Homer and Euripides, these were things that were written on stela, on stone. They were hidden within the temple. Even during the New Year ceremony that we discussed before, called Akitu in Babylon, it was literally the king who read these things in private, in the Holy of Holies, if you will. And what these scholars are saying about the alphabet, which has 22 symbols, the word that we use for the alphabet in Hebrew is otiot. And those of you who are sensitive to the Hebrew knows the power of the word ot. It is a symbol. But from those symbols, you can ultimately put together any sort of concept. And all of a sudden, the written words of the Torah were now publicly available to the congregation. And notice here it says men, women, and children who are here and who are not here. It was literally a revolution as big as the revolution we discussed in prior weeks, where God says, you have no other kings besides me. I'm your only king. You don't worship anybody else. Here too, you get your information directly from the source, and you can interact with that information. And this was an amazing revolution that is on par with anything else that came out of Canaan and the ancient Israelites, and included with Hebrew was Akkadian and Ugaritic and Phoenician. And actually, the Greeks got the 22-letter alphabet from the Phoenicians. They've said it themselves. When we talk about the Delta virus, we have alpha, beta, delta. There are no words like that in Greek. Those are words that come from the Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet. Dalet is delta. Aleph is alpha. So this is, as we approach the new year, this is revolutionary with a capital R.
Yes. I mean, I'm not an expert in alphabet, but yeah, this is all fascinating material. Fascinating.
And it puts into a totally different perspective this concept of the public reading of the text. In all languages, we think read, you need someone who can actually, who can literally read. But in the Torah, the word that we use is likro. And likro is similar to what I was saying before when I talked about Buber and Rosenzweig. It equally applies to reading as it applies to listening or hearing, to calling out. And so really, I think that this image of the Torah ending, and it's saying that every 7 years and by parallel every 7 days, the Torah is to be read in a vernacular, which literally means a people's language, and can be discussed, really ties into so much that we've been talking about on Madlik in terms of the ability for man to own and introduce and interact with our holy texts.
Michael, do you have anything more to... You actually began this conversation with your discussion of the word tumam. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Just a few come up. I've had the good fortune to be studying Nehemiah, and there, when it's described, when Ezra read the Torah, it was read in 4 different ways. It was read exactly as the text presents it, and then there was someone who did the vernacular, so the people could understand it if they didn't know the Hebrew. And then there were 2 other ways which are not quite clear what's meant. And on Rosh Hashanah, I attended a service of the Nushul, which was outdoors, a couple hundred people in a park in Brooklyn, and the Torah was read. It was held up by 2 gentlemen, and a 13 or 14-year-old girl laned, and then she laned a couple of psukim, and then a man with a beautiful voice sang the translation of those psukim, and then Frank London, the trumpeter, played the emotional life on his trumpet. It was very, very, very powerful. So it goes out to the mind, it goes out to the heart, and it goes out to the body in the sense that if you listen to it, you might act differently, which would be a great benefit for all of us.
Hey, Geoffrey, that's amazing, because that's really what you said, and that is the experience of reading is actually much deeper than the way we understand reading.
But it's about listening.
Reading is, you didn't even discuss the fact that reading is music. And Geoffrey, we can actually talk about the fact that the Torah is read in a special tune. And actually, especially on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that tune is a little different, reflective of a more somber kind of Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur spirit. I mean, it's extremely striking. The tune for the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, at least to me, is one of the highlights of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in its power.
Absolutely. I have to echo what you said, Michael. I went to an African-American synagogue in Chicago, outside of Chicago. I believe the rabbi's name was Rabbi Fournier. He's literally a cousin of Michelle Obama. And they read the Torah exactly as you described, and it's exactly as the Talmud describes it. It was with a metargaminam, with a translator. So the person would read the verses, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz, and in the same chant, someone would say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And it was such a moving experience because we forget so many times when we read from the Torah publicly what an empowering, spiritual, and I would say revolutionary, democratizing thing that we are doing in terms of you need to understand this. This is not something that's hidden. This is not something that we don't want you to understand. We want you to ask every question and to provide your novel explanation. And there's the music. You're absolutely right. You can approach it on every different level.
What you said before about reading is also listening. And the question is, for each of us, what are we listening to while that's going on? What are we hearing, and how deeply does the listening go? That's, I think, in real terms, what are we actually hearing or listening to when we hear the words of the Torah? This is a real question, I think, for all of us, and not just the Torah, the davening, all of it. What are we really, really listening to? What are those words really? How deep do those words go? Because they come from a deep place. Do we hear it? How deeply do we go? That's all.
I totally agree. The only thing that I would add, and I want to pick up on Rabbi Adams' earlier comment about the Vilna Gaon saying that when Moses when Joshua wrote the last 8 verses of the Torah that describe Moses' death, he actually scrambled it. He just put out the letters and had the letters combined. And for those of you who know Hasidic stories about the high holidays, you probably have all heard one version or another of the beautiful story of it's the last service on the holiest day of the year of Yom Kippur. And the name of the service is Ne'ilah, because the gates of prayer are about to close. And everybody is thirsty and hungry and waiting for those gates to close and for the shofar to be sounded so they can all go home and eat. And there is the great Hasidic rabbi, whether it's the Baal Shem Tov or the Maggid of Mezrich, who knows, who is standing and waiting, and the stars come out, and the sun goes down, and he's waiting, and finally, 20 minutes after he should have closed the ark, he closes it. And all of the students come, and the people say, what happened? And he said there was a little peasant boy in the back, and the peasant boy had never gone to a cheder, never gone to Hebrew school, never learned anything except the Aleph Bet. And all he was doing was repeating over the letters of the alphabet, of the Aleph Bet, and saying, God, you put them together into the prayer. And the Baal Shem Tov said, we've been here for 24 hours, we've been here for 10 days, we've been here for the whole month of Elul, and we haven't been able to break through the gates of prayer. And the purity and the intensity of this child's repeating over the Aleph Bet, in the same way that Joshua repeated it over according to the Vilna Gaon story, is what has opened up the gates of prayer. And I just have always struck by that question because, yes, Michael, it is the depth of the message, but sometimes it's just the sound of the letter, possibly. Or in this case, coming from my kind of research in the last few days, maybe it's just the revolution of that alphabet. The fact that we all have the right and the ability to portray ourselves and to express ourselves. But I love that story, and I love the fact that, yes, it's at every level.
I mean, that story captures the whole, captures really what it means to appreciate experience. I mean, here, Geoffrey, you're really jumping from reading to experiential. And I think that's probably what Buber meant. You need to experience the text, not just to read it.
Yeah, the prayer that we say that really comes to mind is the Oshamanu prayer. It's the prayer where we confess all of our sins. It's only said on Yom Kippur, and it's in alphabetical order. And according to Buber, who you just mentioned, the reason why the Baal Shem Tov explained is he says, if you're doing your sins, there's no end to it. So luckily the alphabet has only these 22 letters, so we can end somewhere. But again, it just seems throughout the whole day, and I encourage all of you to pay attention to the Machzor, to the prayer book. There seems to be such an emphasis on the alphabetical acrostics, whether it's in the poems and the piyyutim or whether in the Oshamnu prayer. And there's something special there. There's something special about the alphabet. And I'm not talking even at a mystical level, just that we revolutionized the world, and we were part of that revolutionizing in giving every Jew, every human being, the ability to decode the meaning of past generations and make their contribution into the future. And that's an awesome responsibility, but also an amazing capability that we have.
Amazing. So how are we going to bring this back to the shmitah and to the Torah that was placed in front of the people? Well, how does all this relate to that, Geoffrey, in our last minute?
Well, it just seems to me that the fact that this rule was brought up at the very end of the Torah, almost as the climax, shows how important it is, the contribution of our tradition, that the Torah and the words that are written on it are so valued. Anybody who comes to a synagogue is so impressed by, there are no images, but the ark opens up and we worship our book. We are called the people of the book. And that's our contribution, that the value of the written word and the spoken word and the heard word and the transmission of that word and the conversation is ultimately one of our most proudest and most awe-inspiring contributions to the world. And to me, it's something that we have to rejoice in and also be obligated by.
That's a beautiful thought, Geoffrey. As we enter Yom Kippur, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Geoffrey. And a Gemar Chatima Tova. Everybody should have an easy and meaningful fast. And we look forward to next Friday. So on Yom Kippur, you can be looking forward to your Madlik class the following day, because we're going to be talking about the Parshat Vayeilech next week. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, and an easy fast and a wonderful Shabbat to you all. Look forward to seeing you next week. And now, as a special bonus to our podcast listeners, I share with you a new board game that I invented on the first night of Rosh Hashanah. Hope you enjoy it. Looking for financing to pull this together? Contact me if you have some ideas. I'll tell you what I did the first night of Rosh Hashanah. I had my grandkids, and so I had a Monopoly board. And I said to them, what is the goal of this game? And, we worked out it all together, where the idea is you all start with the same amount, and the winner is the one who monopolizes everything. And the losers end up in pauper's jail or bankrupt or in debt to the bank. And I said, I want to invent another or reinvent another game. And it's not called Monopoly, it's called Shofar. And the object of the game is that everybody ends with the same amount that they started. And then I described how the laws of not only shmitah, of the sabbatical year, and the jubilee year, where servants, indentured slaves are freed and left with money to get on their feet, given to them by their masters, where land returns to the estate of the family, where literally it was so easy to contrast the biblical idea of the sabbatical year as opposed to monopoly. That it really, and we were able to discuss it at all levels, both talking about a game and also on a more sophisticated level. So I enjoyed that a lot.